and the push toward privatization displaced the people and eroded the culture that made New Orleans special in the first place. I referenced it in my reflections on the racial shifts unfolding in Harlem, many of which, of course, Smith contemplates along with Richard Schaefer in chapter 7. And then most crucially, in my case, this work helped me to make sense of what was happening a short walk from my childhood home in the Clinton Hill section of central Brooklyn. And that is the construction of the multi-billion-dollar Atlantic Yards and Pacific Park development, which you can see a rendering of it towering above the rest of the neighborhood and resembling more Manhattan, which you can see off in the distance than the rest of the borough. But and the Barclays Center is the crown jewel of that development, and it is now the most prominent symbol of Brooklyn's ascension to gentrification capital of the world. But it was also crucial that when I was initially engaging with Smith, I was also, in a Black Studies course, so I was reading the history that he outlines, along with histories of race, structural racism, and place annihilation, as well as Black community formation. So here are some of the texts I was engaging with, first when I started, like the Philadelphia Negro, Black Metropolis, and then what I engaged with more as a grad student, leading up to even the amazing Black in Place by Professor Brandy Thompson Summers, who just spoke. So, and also seeing the relationship between race, place, and power bear out in the world around me, it really demonstrated for me that, just as much as the new urban frontier is a resolutely economic creation in Neil Smith's words, it's also a staunchly racial one. And so simply put, we can't understand who lives in our cities, where they live, how they got there, and how they're able or unable to stay put. We've got to reckon with the ways racial hierarchies remain central to the elite-driven sort of top-down organization of the built environment and of urban life. So today I just want to build on Smith's theories of gentrification and uneven development by emphasizing the role of racism and of racial capitalism in the production of urban space and inequality. And in particular, I want to talk about how the creation and negation of value out of the racialization of space has rendered Black communities particularly vulnerable to gentrification and the myriad forms of displacement that come along with it. So my current research projects, as you heard, were situated within my hometown of Brooklyn, which, as I mentioned, and as you all well know, is an international symbol of gentrification. So despite the overwhelming emphasis on Harlem and all of its historic importance, it's actually Brooklyn that is the demographic and political center of Black life in New York City, as well as home to one of the largest contiguous Black communities in the US. And so the challenges and opportunities facing the borough's some 880,000 odd Black residents really magnifies the racial implications of that ascent. So the resulting displacement of longtime residents, erasure of local histories, and destruction of social networks and community institutions then not only raises questions about the fundamental inequalities of capitalist property markets, but also highlights the interlocking nature of racial and spatial justice. And for the average Black Brooklynite and other residents marginalized along lines of class, race, ethnicity, and other forms of difference, the notion of the new urban frontier is far more than a metaphor. So it speaks to the direct ways that urban planning and urbanization have been tied to racial and spatial dispossession throughout US history, as well as to other forms of domination and extraction of wealth, of labor, and other resources that have created cumulative disadvantage among affected communities. And so continuously since then, public policies and private actions have maintained these unequal power relations by relegating people of different races to different places. And more specifically, they've done so by valorizing and protecting spaces racialized as white, while designating non-white spaces for neglect, exploitation, and destruction. So the conflation of whiteness, progress, and profit remains a dominant frame for understanding elite-driven development of the built environment and of contemporary gentrification. And it's also a powerful determinant of the unequal distribution of the benefits and burdens of urban restructuring. So as a couple of the speakers have mentioned, public policy is absolutely a primary mechanism for enacting this inequality. And over the past century and into the present, these dynamics are borne out in what psychiatrists Mindy Thompson-Fullilove and Roderick Wallace call a persistent policy of serial forced displacement. And that's a critical set of government policies that have subject affected communities to repetitive cycles of disruption and uncertainty, perpetuating power and resource imbalances that reverberate in every aspect of urban life. So these policies have created cumulative disadvantage among already marginalized people, heightening their vulnerability to risk, dislocation, and institutional and interpersonal violence. They've also undercut rich legacies of resistance, traumatized families and support networks, created barriers to wealth, and stymied political power. And much of the development we see today depends on the effects of these policies, such as depressed property values, blight, financial precarity, and foreclosure as prerequisites for real estate speculation. And so the subprime mortgage crisis was mentioned as one prominent example of a policy crisis that enables that dynamic. There's also the third party transfer program, which allows the city to seize properties with unpaid taxes and utility bills and then turn them over to nonprofits for the purpose of preservation, allegedly, but it ultimately just basically robs modest landlords from their properties over what are often minuscule debts compared to the value of the property. And so, not coincidentally, this policy has hit Black and Brown homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods hardest, which again strips equity from these already vulnerable communities rather than making it easier for them to stay put or even addressing the reasons that they are disproportionately likely to fall behind on taxes and municipal fees. So in these and other instances, the extraction of wealth from these communities facilitates development for the profit of private real estate interests in other parts of the city. It pushes these communities into places of deeper disadvantage. It severs social, cultural, and political ties, and in the names of always implicitly racialized notions of profit and progress. And frankly, examining this history of serial forced displacement actually makes me want to revisit Smith's incredibly useful concept of revanchism, because if we think of revanchism as having really set in the 80s and with Giuliani time and zero tolerance, we really run the risk of overlooking the ways that the city has always been inhospitable and punitive for certain groups of people, and the way these policies have really created an intentional precarity among Black property owners and institutions that all too often leaves them just in a basically a perpetual state of instability and like on the border of loss and erasure. So I'd love to work through that with you all during the Q&A or even offline. So again, as Smith said, and I've observed, we're moving from, brownstone renovations to creating new urban environments. That's the old Domino Sugar Factory. That's a rendering of what it's starting to look like. It's as crazy as it looks in the pictures. We've got gentrification in new locales, going deeper into Black neighborhoods than ever before, escalating old problems of racial and economic inequality. This is Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is home to the highest concentration of low-income housing in the United States. And there's talk about privatizing the New York City Housing Authority, well, aspects of it, in order to basically meet the $400 million they're behind in repairs. And so if history tells us anything, privatization does not work for the most vulnerable of us. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And then another feature I'm interested in, along with folks like Brandy and Professor Summers and Professor Shkuda, another feature I'm interested in contemporary gentrification is evaluation of Blackness and the cultural sphere, really, in terms of diversity and various forms of commodification. So for me, this is partly an outgrowth of post-civil rights era mandates around integration and fair housing, but also about the rise of the Black culture industry in the past 30 years or so. So here's hip hop's first billionaire, entertainment mogul, Sean Jay-Z Carter, and his involvement with the construction of the Barclays Center is a really excellent illustrative, it's a great example of that dilemma. So I use him and Black Brooklyn icons like Jackie Robinson and Spike Lee to really work out the way that Black culture is capital, and it's something that can be commodified and put on the market, but it's also a mechanism for building community or for illuminating or concealing structural inequality. Another example of that, the Nets now have these Bed-Stuy jerseys and these Basquiat inspired jerseys as well. Spoiler alert, the Barclays Center is not in Bed-Stuy, and they actually siphoned public funding that was intended to ameliorate low employment or high unemployment rates rather in areas like Bed-Stuy and historically Black Crown Heights, and in Fort Greene, which is also home to a significant public housing structure, and basically just to funnel it back into this the arena. So there's more arenas as public goods type of work there as well. So as I think about the way race weaves its way into every aspect of urban life, from something as concrete as money and access to land and resources to something as seemingly fluid as aesthetics, I'd be remiss, of course, in the spirit of Neil Smith, not to draw on practices of local communities and how they've reckoned with these realities and use them to develop concrete demands for justice and envision a way out. So where Smith observes that gentrification is class war sign on the Lower East Side, I've spoken with activists who are more upfront in calling gentrification really an act of white supremacy, to put it plainly. And that's something that several of them have actually attributed to increased exposure to language and ideologies around social justice in the wake of and in tandem with Black Lives Matter movements and racial justice uprisings. So in turn, they link gentrification and other forms of exclusionary development to matters of housing affordability, police violence, labor exploitation, healthcare access, political participation, so on and so forth, among other issues that affect people across lines of difference, but have distinctly racial consequences. So during the Q&A, I hope we get to discuss the importance of keeping structural racism in the frame as we seek to understand the current issues we face and as we seek to develop comprehensive solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we'll move to Elizabeth Korver-Glenn.
So let me, here we go. Okay, well, it's great to be here with you all this afternoon, and I'm really thrilled to have been invited today to be a part of this conference. And you know, as Amanda said, I too was really influenced by Neil Smith's work, in particular early on in graduate school, and shaped a lot of my thinking and a lot of the reading that I ended up doing after that. So I'm really excited to kind of engage and think about my work with you all today. Full caveat here is that I don't come at the questions surrounding gentrification specifically through the lens of gentrification research. I had actually intentionally in my research had avoided asking specific questions about gentrification. And that's another story for another time. But I really approach my research, particularly that I'll be talking about today, from a very broad lens about urban inequality, particularly residential segregation, and answering questions about how housing markets continue to divide cities by race, and particularly within housing markets, real estate professionals. And so as I got further into that research, it seemed that gentrification found me, despite my best attempts to not intentionally focus on it. And that's the beauty, I think, of ethnographic and interview-based research, is that I get to follow the leads as they emerge in the field, and that's kind of what's happened. So what I started off doing was really investigating what Dr. Mary Patillo has called the missing middles of urban inequalities. And in particular, I became very interested in housing market intermediaries. And these are people that I and others conceptualize the kind of the connectors or the disconnectors between individuals and social and material resources. And so in particular, I began to see that we don't know a lot about middles, as Dr. Patillo has pointed out, and especially as it relates to gentrification and racialized gentrification, or the reimagining, reconfiguration of urban neighborhood spaces according to these kind of dual and co-constitutive dynamics of race and class. And in fact, I think, as Amanda has just mentioned, that all gentrification in the US is racialized, but this isn't the definitions panel, so we'll leave that for maybe for offline or Q&A or whatever. But instead, I'm going to keep my focus on top of this panel, which is how gentrification, and specifically racialized gentrification, happens. And relative to the whole corpus of gentrification literature, we know really very little about who is doing that connecting work, like who is connecting relatively affluent and or white people to racially and or economically marginalized urban areas. How does that connecting happen? what is the result and what are the consequences of that connecting work or that disconnecting work. So today I'm going to dig into some of those gaps a bit, and specifically I'm going to investigate who are the middles, the intermediaries of racialized gentrification, how these middles create racialized gentrification, and what the implication of their actions are. So I'm going to be drawing on some research I conducted in urban Houston, Texas. This research focused specifically on real estate professionals, especially with housing developers and real estate agents. And today we're going to home in specifically on housing developers because they're so understudied, they're almost completely unmonitored, and they're so influential in how not only gentrification, but in particular for us today, gentrification happens and urban development happens in general. I conducted a year of ethnographic fieldwork with 13 real estate agents and housing developers. I followed them around the city as they scoped out land and neighborhoods, went to city planning, met with other professionals, tried to get investors interested in their work, sold their homes, marketed their homes that they were redeveloping, and recorded those interactions in field notes. I also conducted in-depth interviews with over 70 real estate professionals, including about 10 housing developers and about 35 to 40 real estate agents, among 30 consumers and other players as well. So I'll be drawing on that body of data to talk a little bit about how gentrification happened in urban Houston, Texas. So I found that broadly speaking, the housing developers in my study who worked in urban areas began their decision-making process about where to build at the neighborhood level. And specifically, they used racist interpretations of neighborhoods and neighborhood reputation to select areas they believed would be the most profitable. And they assumed that white neighborhoods, or perhaps Latinx areas near white areas, were the most desirable and would be most desirable to white home buyers, and would therefore be the most economically profitable. So there's all these layers of assumptions that developers were using to make these neighborhood level decisions. Developers then focused their attention on these areas, buying land and building or renovating homes, as well as building up local infrastructure and beefing up local home values. So Brad, a white middle-aged developer, provides a first illustration of how this happened among the developers in my study. He explained, white people will move into a Mexican neighborhood. They will not move into a Black neighborhood. Straight up, it never happens. White people can assimilate with Mexicans because they're generally family-oriented, they're generally religious, they're hardworking, so you can relate to them. You can generally get along with them. And so I asked him, well, why won't white people move into a Black neighborhood? And then he makes the anti-Black racism of his development decision-making rubric very plain. He said, because it's too much of a cultural difference. It's not safe generally. They are generally, single parents raising kids that are crazy. And he goes on to elaborate what we know are explicitly racist comments about Black families and Black neighborhoods, and justified his development decisions according to this racism. So they made these decisions about neighborhoods based not only on their perceptions, but also on what they believed others' perceptions were of neighborhoods. In particular, they anchored their perceptions in white consumers' understandings of neighborhoods. And as Brad's quote illustrates, this racism was anchored in anti-Blackness, such that although Latinx neighborhoods might be okay, if risky prospect for development, Black neighborhoods were totally off limits. And these racist perceptions were rooted in neighborhood racial reputations, which developers used to interpret their mental maps of Houston. Stan, a Latino developer active in multiple Houston neighborhoods, described his development strategy in a similar fashion. He said, we're not really allowed to talk about it, but the reality is people, how do I say this tactfully? People won't buy in Black areas. They'll buy in Hispanic areas, reluctantly. And as a business person, I've got to build where people will buy. There are just certain areas you don't go into. So Stan's, Brad's, and other developers' decisions about where to purchase and redevelop land were influenced by their perceptions of white prospective homebuyers as the default and most desirable home buyer, and by their understandings of whites' racist residential prejudices. And their perceptions and development choices help illuminate how gentrification unfolds differently across racially distinct areas, and in a multiracial context like Houston is oriented around anti-Blackness, with Latinx areas seen as more socially and economically promising a prospect for development. So once they made this general neighborhood level where to build decision, they had to find specific plots of land to build on. And at this point, they engaged in reverse blockbusting, whether by contacting specific homeowners in person or via mailers or placing signs advertising home purchasing services. Developers relied on racist ideas about Latinx and Black homeowners as gullible or as having little knowledge of housing market dynamics. And they did so because they believed they could purchase these homes for bargain prices, particularly in areas they believed that whites were increasingly buying. And their aim was to purchase low, redevelop the land for white consumption, and sell high. So reverse blockbusting is a close cousin to what we know as blockbusting, the now illegal practice that real estate agents used in early and mid 20th century American cities. I don't think I need to rehash this for this audience, but basically, real estate agents go door to door. They convince white homeowners to sell their houses low by preying on white homeowners' racist fears about Black home buyers moving in, or new Black residents moving in. And then real estate agents would sell those same homes, turn around and sell them for exorbitantly high prices to those Black families. But in contrast to this practice from decades past, housing developers in my study targeted homeowners of color, reversing the flow of targeting and property turnover. And this reversal was very similar to the process of predatory inclusion that Seamster and Sharon Chenier and Professor Taylor have talked about, this process whereby members of a marginalized group are provided with access to a good, service, or opportunity from which they've historically been excluded, but under conditions that jeopardize the benefits of access. So the developers in my study did not bank on homeowners' racist fears as their real estate agent counterparts did in the era before fair housing laws. Rather, they assumed these homeowners would be the least likely to understand housing market dynamics and would be the most likely to be in a precarious economic position that would motivate them to sell their homes at a below market price. And so what blockbusting or reverse blockbusting have in common is that they both rely on these racist ideas that relegate individuals of color to the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy and do so in order to extract wealth. So the developers in my study specifically targeted Latinx homeowners in particular, and this is related to the first set of findings about which neighborhoods they were also targeting. But I also observed some of this reverse blockbusting in Black neighborhoods as well, and we'll come to an example of that in a minute. So Brad, for instance, targeted Latinx homeowners in white areas to find homes at bargain prices that he could tear down to make room for new development. So when I asked him about why Latinx families were moving out of the White Heights neighborhood, for instance, he explained, because they get bought out, right? I mean, I buy houses every day from Hispanics. They move somewhere else. We take their property, destroy it, and build a house for a rich white family to move in. So then when I asked him where he thought the Latinx families moved, he first said he did not know, but then he guessed they moved to Katy, Texas, which is a large Houston suburb. He then rationalized his strategy of targeting Latinx homeowners for land acquisition by positing that these families had made good money and they could just move to the suburbs. He said they'll just move out to the suburbs or Katy. I mean, they make good money. Usually their properties are paid for and they make $300,000 to $400,000 to go buy a really nice house in Katy so they can get out of their 2-bedroom bath bungalow that's falling down. So apparently it did not occur to Brad, who was also active as a licensed real estate agent and had at least one real estate agent working for him, to go on to represent those Latinx families when they purchased those supposed $300,000 to $400,000 homes in the suburbs. It didn't occur to him that this was a possibility, thus showing the very racialized market foundations of the developers' choices in the housing market. Their choices were about maintaining a racial economic order and not just maximizing economic efficiency. So in addition to contacting Latinx homeowners in person, developers sometimes make contact by mailing letters and flyers advertising services to specific homeowners. Mateo, for example, kept this form letter in his files. In addition to providing details about 2 options for selling the home, both of which were under market value, the letter reflected Mateo's desire to build a sense of shared purpose with prospective Latinx sellers, which he emphasized by including his name and personal cell phone number at the bottom of the letter. Other involved stakeholders understood and influenced reverse blockbusting among housing developers. So for instance, in August of 2015, I attended a meeting between Casey, who was a Black developer informant working in a predominantly Black Houston neighborhood, and Rob, a white planning consultant, at a meeting they were having. During the meeting held at Casey's office, Rob repeatedly emphasized Casey's need for a better, more concrete plan to acquire land for housing development moving forward. His advice was to use Casey's local knowledge of the neighborhood to quote, hold on to land, target particular areas before speculation by other developers happens, end quote. At the same time, he recommended bringing in an outside consultant who would help implement this plan, moving forward and acquiring land from a list of specific properties they had already created. It was important to hire this outside person soon, he said, because, quote, we need to get that land now so that we can sell it privately at a nice profit. We need someone to do the plan that isn't tied to race, class, socioeconomic status baggage. So in other words, Rob was proposing that because of his and Casey's local ties, specifically the baggage of their interracial, intraracial, and interclass dynamics and relationships, none of those present in the room could themselves target the Black homeowners on the list. So they wanted to hire an outside person to do the reverse blockbusting that he had just described. Acquire property at a low price in order to sell it high, exploiting Black homeowners in the process. So in contrast to this racist extractive development decisions pursued by most of the developers in my study, there was a second alternative and uncommon strategy that illustrated alternate visions of neighborhoods, people, and development. And these alternate visions elevated the social, cultural, and economic value of communities of color and were applied to development decisions in ways that did not prioritize white consumers' racist prejudices. For instance, Pablo was aware of neighborhood racial reputations and the negative interpretations that white consumers gave to Black Houston neighborhoods. He gave every indication, at least during the field work that I did with him, that he was basically pursuing an opposite strategy to the other developers in my study. So during our first meeting, in fact, as he showed me around a couple of new homes he was building in a development in a Black Houston neighborhood, he said, quote, our strategy has always been where there's land and strong community and to work with the neighborhood. We buy empty land. We don't knock on people's doors because I think that's disrespectful. We noticed that between here and Camden Street, it seemed like more of a neighborhood feel and the neighborhood is welcoming. And these alternate visions of neighborhoods, people, and development affected development decisions of two developers in my study. They planned and developed homes in Black and Latinx areas. They contributed to local infrastructure as when Pablo's company improved local drainage systems. And at the same time, they profited from these endeavors. For instance, during my study, Pablo's newly constructed homes sold quickly, most of them to Black and Latinx home buyers. And although their actions likely also contributed to gentrification, the way that they pursued development was not extractive. It was not the same kind of predatory inclusion that other developers in my study pursued. Instead, these developers were aware of and cared about the potential consequences of their actions for local residents, and as a result, worked with the local community to ensure minimal disruption to the community. So quickly to recap, housing developers are incredibly important, understudied, and virtually unmonitored housing market intermediaries that work in overt and behind the scenes ways to shape the racial and economic contours of cities. In my study, they prioritized white neighborhoods and white prospective home buyers' racism when deciding where to build. And in short, that meant that their neighborhood level decision-making really revolved around anti-Blackness. In turn, this meant they more often and consistently targeted lower and middle income Latinx areas, especially those that were proximate to white areas. It also meant that at the individual plot of land level, they wielded reverse blockbusting against Latinx and at times Black homeowners, pursuing a strategy of predatory inclusion that again rested on a bedrock of racist and classist assumptions. Developers' decisions had numerous implications for residents. They built up local infrastructure in the areas they had chosen for development, including streets, drainage, sidewalks, and lighting. And in a separate quantitative analysis I conducted, I found that home values increased in areas with more new development, net of other characteristics throughout the Houston area. These findings help out flesh out patterns uncovered in other gentrification research. Who does the work and how they do it have enormous consequences for how gentrification unfolds and what the consequences are for local residents. Future research should further track and unpack developers' role in housing market processes. For instance, comparing how local racial and economic hierarchies and histories shape understandings of neighborhood racial reputation and variation in development choices and racialized gentrification. Thinking specifically of the context where my current institution is, Albuquerque, which has a very different racial history, and neighborhoods have very different inflection than Houston, for instance. Or further tracking for-profit housing developers' myriad connections with other types of actors, including nonprofit neighborhood and development organizations, government actors, and monies and real estate agents and other housing market professionals. These and other questions are crucial to unpack, as housing developers are key in creating and sustaining the market they imagine. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. All right, now we'll move to our third and final presenter, Aaron Shkuda.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to, before I start, give a thanks to both Tim and Johanna for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be in a conversation among some of my favorite scholars, both people I've met, but also people who I only know for your excellent work. I mentioned in the Q&A earlier that I teach a gentrification seminar every year, and it almost feels like this conference is my syllabus coming to life, because so many of your works have really shaped my and my students' understanding of gentrification. And of course, in every version of this class, we read excerpts of The New Urban Frontier, and Neil Smith's framing of gentrification has been central to our collective understanding of this process. This includes scholars such as myself, whose focus is on the role of the arts and culture in urban development and gentrification. In The New Urban Frontier, Smith places what he calls the culture industry, art dealers and patrons, gallery owners and artists, designers and critics, writers and performers, at the center of the gentrification process. In the Lower East Side, art tamed the neighborhood for the real estate industry. And two actors are critical to this process. Artists, as real estate agents and art world gentrifiers, Smith writes, worked in tandem, and galleries, which provided a meeting place for grassroots ambition and talent and establishment money. So I want to use my talk today to show evidence from how New York SoHo neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s, research taken from my book, The Lofts in SoHo, both confirms and complicates Smith's narrative. Individual artists and artist advocacy groups established a role for the culture industry in SoHo, not only by resourcefully reshaping the built environment, advocating for policy change, and overcoming the hostility and disinterest of policymakers and planners. Artists became savvy real estate investors, but often by ignoring the regular rules of investment and risk. As a historian, I want to raise the question of whether the dynamics that Smith outlines between cultural and real estate in the New Urban Frontier are applicable more to his only to his Lower East Side case study in the late 80s and early 90s, or whether they can be applied more broadly to other neighborhoods and periods of time. I also want to ask similar questions about the role of arts institutions. Galleries brought visitors and capital to SoHo, but the role of galleries in contemporary East Los Angeles and Detroit indicates a complicated and evolving relationship between arts institutions and gentrification. Galleries can bring new forms of financial capital and attention to a neighborhood, but can also provide alternative routes to more equitably developed disinvested areas. Just to take you through a little bit of the history of SoHo, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, maybe some of you have read parts of my book, but it's something where I think it's worth kind of focusing on a little more detail. The artist-led transformation of SoHo began in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when artists began moving into the neighborhood's industrial loft buildings. At the time, the area was dominated by garment manufacturing and waste recycling firms. A single structural type shaped SoHo's development and redevelopment, the industrial loft. Built in the 3 decades after the end of the Civil War, typical loft buildings are 4 to 6 story structures with cast iron facades, brick walls, and interior cast iron columns supporting wood floors. The first floors were designed as showrooms or commercial spaces, while the upper floors were unpartitioned high ceiling rooms used for warehousing and manufacturing. Starting in roughly 1960, a group of artists began renting this underused space and transforming the very elements that made industrial lofts increasingly unproductive for industry into components of the new housing typology, the residential loft. To turn industrial lofts into homes, artists did much of the work themselves. They renovated they removed industrial waste, connected their living spaces to gas, electricity, plumbing, and heating systems, installed working elevators, new roofs, and fire escapes. Residents learned a substantial amount about home renovation as they went along, and often relied on the growing community in SoHo for the expertise required to renovate their lofts. Of course, when artists began moving to SoHo, they did so illegally. Lofts were zoned for industry and in many cases still contained operating industrial businesses. Under New York state law, as soon as a building contained more than 2 residences, it became a multiple dwelling and was required to satisfy certain safety and health requirements that industrial lofts did not meet. Nevertheless, faced with declining demand among industrial businesses, loft owners often rented to artists. To shape policy, SoHo artists pioneered new arguments and advocacy techniques. This process began in February 1961, when a series of fires in loft buildings led to inspections by the New York City Fire Department, leaving artists vulnerable to eviction. In response, SoHo artists began to organize. In April 1961, they formed their first advocacy group, the Artist Tenants Association, or ATA. The first loft policy was essentially let artists break the law in an organized way. In April 1961, New York Mayor Robert Wagner announced a plan in which artists were allowed to live in buildings zoned for commercial use if they notified the city's buildings department and hung an 8 by 10-inch sign near the door with the letters AIR on it. The letter stood for Artist in Residence. This policy was rather informal and never really worked in practice. In May 1964, the New York State multiple dwelling law was amended to allow certified artists to live and work in combined loft spaces in SoHo. This law still had major flaws. First among these, the city did not have a mechanism for determining who was an artist. So in 1970, a second group of artists formed what they called the SoHo Artists Association, or SAA. Thanks to their efforts, in January 1971, New York Mayor John Lindsay approved a zoning change that allowed artists to live in certain SoHo lofts as long as the Department of Cultural Affairs certified them as an artist. By 1976, as demand for loft space rose, a zoning policy for NoHo, which is the area north of Houston Street, allowed artists to live legally in converted loft buildings, while a separate zoning ordinance for nearby Tribeca allowed non-artists to legally convert some lofts for the first time. Even with this policy from the mid-1970s onward, the demand for loft apartments exceeded the number of legal loft spaces available. In 1980, the administration of New York Mayor Ed Koch formulated a rezoning plan that would legalize loft conversions in much of lower and midtown Manhattan. In June 1982, New York State passed its loft law that created a framework for legal loft conversion that exists in amended form to this day. To bring about these policy changes, SoHo artists utilize a variety of advocacy strategies and rhetorical framings. The ATA made explicit connections between their living situation and the, quote, big business of art in New York, noting that it brought $500 million in revenue to the city each year. To highlight the economic impact of the arts, the ATA organized an artist strike in April 1964, in which 80 of the city's leading galleries closed in response to recent enforcement of commercial zoning regulations, which denied loft space to artists. The same day, 1,000 artists marched in front of City Hall to demand legalization of their homes. The SoHo Artists Association, the second group I mentioned, emphasized the power that artists had to reinvigorate urban neighborhoods. As co-founder Wybert Wigand argued, after all, the atmosphere we create is part of what attracts high caliber people here to live and work. The emphasis on artist impact on urban neighborhoods led the group to organize a series of loft tours. The first of these was a festival called 10 Downtown, which began in 1968 as an informal tour of artist lofts. By 1973, the event drew 6,000 people for what the New York Times called the city's walk and climb-a-thon par excellence. In 1970, the SAA organized the SoHo Artist Festival, a yearly event co-sponsored by the city's Department of Recreation and Cultural Affairs. The event drew upwards of 10,000 people, with the streets full of gaping uptowners and suburbanites, most of them puffing down steep old staircases. So though Smith found that art denotes a stable neighborhood in the Lower East Side, the trajectory from art to real estate was not linear in SoHo. Artists did a substantial amount of work to regulate the practice of living in converted SoHo lofts, and they did so to maintain their own affordable live workspaces and to maintain a distinct community of creative people, not to generate real estate value. In fact, members of the community observed that it was their very disinterest in real estate that made SoHo artists such accidentally savvy investors. Performance artist and frame shop owner Jared Bark observed that while standard real estate investors were scared off by the risk of loft properties, artists dove right in, assuming that there was a critical mass of people living in lofts and the city would never evict them en masse. As Bark said, in fact, we were lucky in that we perceived accurately that this was a pretty risk-free investment, and so we got incredible bargains. In hindsight, New York City leaders could have changed zoning laws and building codes to let residents and/or developers renovate lofts into homes, or otherwise encouraged a wholesale redevelopment of SoHo. Yet urban planners and elected officials were slow to act to encourage the grassroots redevelopment of SoHo. Even when advocacy groups seemed to anticipate the arguments of Richard Florida, arguing that they attract high caliber people to New York, SoHo redevelopment was structured by a patchwork collection of public policies and interventions. This is one of the reasons that highly capitalized developers are relatively absent in SoHo. So I want to talk quickly about the role of galleries. Soon after artists moved to SoHo, a new generation of entrepreneurs followed. Galleries opened in SoHo to be close to the artists producing work in the neighborhood, as well as to take advantage of the area's inexpensive, unpartitioned commercial space. While having art galleries in an artist's neighborhood may seem like a long-standing practice, this move was a fairly radical one in the late 1960s. Beginning with Paula Cooper, the first gallery to permanently open in SoHo in 1968, the number of galleries in the area grew to 5 by 1970, 80 by 1973, and over 100 by 1979. Up-and-coming dealers like Cooper and established gallery owners like Leo Castelli, who represented people like Donald Judd, Roy Lichtenstein, Frank Stella, and Andy Warhol, who opened in SoHo in 1970, tipped the weight of the New York art world downtown. At the same time, a group of artists joined together to open nonprofit cooperatives in local lofts. They would split the cost and labor of renting and renovating a loft, and members would do everything from hanging art to answering the phone. In exchange, they would get to periodically show their work. The SoHo art scene was an open, visitor-friendly experience. Though commercial gallery owners looked to make a profit, they envisioned their spaces as accessible to both the art buying community and the general public. For-profit galleries welcomed casual visitors, but relied on an international network of collectors, museums, and corporations to buy the vast share of their inventory. The operators of nonprofit galleries wanted to sell their own art, but it was their sweat equity and financial capital, as well as their ability to obtain government arts funding that kept the doors open. Visitors could view art without their purchases being the critical factor keeping the institutions financially viable. These galleries brought substantial numbers of visitors to the neighborhood. Here I have a map that I created as part of my research about the galleries and sort of art-related commercial businesses that opened in SoHo. While some who came to the neighborhood sought out painting and sculpture, others traveled there to experience dance, theater, music, and interdisciplinary performance art. Soon, restaurants, boutiques, and other art-related enterprises began opening to cater to the local artist population, as well as a growing number of art-related tourists. This parallels Smith's findings in the Lower East Side, where the culture industry attracted tourists, consumers, gallery gazers, art patrons, potential immigrants, all fueling gentrification. And the relationship between galleries and urban development continues to shape conversations about art and gentrification in the present day. So I'm switching here, and I do want to give the caveat that this is, I will want you to raise questions that sort of have come out of my observations of other cities and some of my teaching. I realized in the previous session, we had an expert on Boyle Heights who wasn't able to present. And our first professor, Professor Lin, also is more of an expert on these areas than I am. So I want to raise sort of questions that have come out of my observations of some of the gallery protests in Boyle Heights for conversation, and speak a little bit about Detroit, which is a city which I know more from my teaching than my research. So since 2016, protesters have targeted galleries as generators of gentrification and displacement in the Latinx neighborhood of Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. They have used boycotts, picket lines, and occupations, as well as online activity to carry out their goals. In March 2017, a nonprofit art gallery called PSST, or I guess it's generated crowds of protesters who chanted slogans in Spanish and English, including, "We don't need galleries, we need higher salaries." These protests eventually caused this gallery to close. In March 2018, gallerist Laura Owens closed her 356 Mission Gallery in Boyle Heights after a year of protests. Shortly after her decision, 3 more galleries announced they would leave the neighborhood. Protesters in Boyle Heights have linked galleries with a process of what they call art washing. According to Angel Luna, a resident of the neighborhood and a member of the Boyle Heights Alliance Against Art Washing and Displacement, art washing is the use of art and artistic labor to perpetuate and enable gentrification. The group accused the galleries of paving the way for new development and speculation that will eventually end up displacing residents. As a historian, I'm interested in the phrases like art washing, because as scholars, we can probe this phrase further and ask, how do galleries wash and what is being washed away? Art washing implies the imposition of something generic onto a distinct local community. And there is something to this claim. Art galleries, even nonprofit ones, are part of national and international networks of artists, buyers, and funders. In SoHo, galleries sold art to buyers from other cities, museums in other parts of the country, and foundations that funded work across the globe. And a similar dynamic seems to be at work at Boyle Heights. Though it's interesting that PSST, one of the galleries that generated protests, was a nonprofit. So again, it would be interesting to sort of dig into the funding mechanism and kind of who exactly or what exactly keeps that institution viable. Kind of brings up the question that Kwame addressed earlier about the role of the foundation in Kingston. Galleries play a more complicated role, I think, with Detroit's Heidelberg Project, a block-long installation collage by African-American artist and Detroit native Tyree Guyton. The works at the core of the project have consisted of houses covered with brightly colored polka dots, LPs, or stuffed animals, and empty lots filled with meticulously and densely layered piles of shoes, discarded toys, vacuum cleaners, and other objects. That's to quote my colleague Judith Amara. Not everyone has viewed Heidelberg positively. Detroit mayors Coleman Young and Dennis Archer ordered teardowns of portions of the project in 1991 and 1999, and 12 fires, likely arsons, took place between 2013 and 2015. Yet the project has endured and is the third most visited tourist attraction in the city. More recently, Heidelberg has been part of broader efforts to catalyze redevelopment and disinvest in Detroit. Under former Director of Planning and Development for the City of Detroit, Maurice Cox, Heidelberg created a strategic framework that would allow them to apply for control of 40 vacant parcels surrounding the site. The aim was to expand the reach of the project beyond the original installation, as Guyton always saw the work as a catalyst for community development. In June 2017, Heidelberg announced that it had purchased a building adjacent to the project and its adjoining lots for $490,000. 2 months later, Guyton and his partner joined with Jesse Corey and Rula David, owners of Interstate Gallery and One by Run, to purchase a 20,000 square foot building 2 blocks from the Heidelberg project for $350,000. One project would become the project's headquarters, sorry, I'm going ahead, while the other would be a cafe, gallery, and event space. Funding from the gallery world would be key to transitioning to the next stage of the project. Jesse Corey, who is the white co-owner of Interstate Gallery, grew up in exurban Romeo, Michigan, and became coming to Detroit as a teenager in the mid-1990s, and was attracted early to the Heidelberg project. When his art gallery moved downtown in 2013, he approached Guyton and the two collaborated on shows in 2014 and 16. In 2017, Corey sold his 3-story brick building in Eastern Market near downtown Detroit for $1.2 million, and 2 months later began investing in the Heidelberg project. In this case, few are protesting the involvement of the gallery in a near $1 million purchase of property by an artist organization on Detroit's east side. Though there is concern over the gentrification of some portions of Detroit, there is hope that the collaboration between an outsider-insider artist, Guyton, a gallery, and the city's planning apparatus might bring about more equitable development in the city and bring needed funds to an area shaped by structural racism, redlining, deindustrialization, and predatory mortgage practices. So in my talk today, I hope that I built off Smith's work by analyzing the underlying processes by which forms of art and culture contribute to neighborhood change and gentrification. Smith's work provides scholars like myself with a jumping off point, but in the case of artists, galleries, and gentrification, it is our task to probe deeper. Who are the people we refer to as artists? What work do they produce? Do they have gallery representation? And do they support themselves with work outside of artistic production? The answer is inevitably yes. Do dancers bring establishment money to a neighborhood in the same way that visual artists do? What specific forms of capital, financial and cultural, can artists access while others cannot? What types of crowds do galleries bring to neighborhoods? What income keeps these galleries lights on? And how do developers view arts institutions? And critically, of course, how does race structure this dynamic? Both the cultural and real estate industries require the actions of individuals whose decisions and interventions warrant our close attention, both in historical scholarship as well as in the present day. So I think I will stop there and happy to move on to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thanks to all our presenters for those really wonderful, thought-provoking presentations with great slides as well, right? Great pictures, which is always nice. In addition to insightful analysis. In order to sort of kick off the discussion, I just wanted to sort of throw in a couple of thoughts, and if you want to respond to them, fine. If you don't, we can move right on to questions from the audience. The first point has to do with not just this panel, but previous panels as well. Which is, I think there's been, since the publication of the New Urban Frontier, effort to complicate or reframe or refocus some of Smith's analysis by trying to take into account things that Smith either ignored or downplayed or just didn't have as central to his analysis. So Aaron, for example, is trying, I think, to get us to think a bit more critically or to complicate the role of art and artists in the processes of gentrification, to offer a slightly different perspective to Smith's one. And both Elizabeth and Amanda and some previous speakers have sought for a number of very good reasons to have us think more carefully about the place of race in gentrification, either at the back end, as it were, in terms of the effects of gentrification disproportionately affecting African Americans in particular, but also particularly in Elizabeth's presentation right at the front end with respect to the framing, the racialized framing of racial property markets. But I guess the question is, where does this leave what was central for Smith, and that is to say capitalism? So where do the complications and then insights that come at the problem of and the question of gentrification from different angles, where do they leave capitalism? Is capitalism still central? Is it the overarching dynamic in which these other dynamics play out? Or is it merely one of a series of factors which shape urban development and redevelopment? And sort of connected to that, and I think this was a quote from, maybe from Amanda's presentation. Paul, I just got the quote, but not who said it. But so should we be thinking about gentrification as an act of white supremacy, where in which case capitalism is wholly secondary to the analysis? Or should we think about the construction of racial conflict as an effect of capitalism, or what, if something else? And then the other point I just wanted to raise was this, I think, really nettlesome question. I think it was Brandy Summers who mentioned this, the quote I mentioned from her from earlier, which, you know, that poor people like nice stuff too. And where this leaves us with respect to what to do about urban inequality or dilapidation, and the hollowing out of public spaces. The problem, it seems to me, at least in part, is that even if you make the most basic improvements to any place, for example, I don't know, putting in a new playground or a playground, let alone an art gallery, it puts pressure on property prices in those neighborhoods almost inevitably. And of course, if you invest properly in schools, if you upgrade housing, if you create art spaces, etc., then that puts even more pressure on housing and therefore on rents, and therefore potentially leads to displacement. And so the question really is, if it's true that house prices, rents are so vulnerable to even fairly modest improvements, is there a way around the problem of, on the one hand, either not making improvements and keeping everyone's rent low, or it seeming inevitable that any kind of substantive improvements to neighborhoods has this downstream displacing effect, or if not displacement, to make things, to increase hardship by raising rents or the cost of living in general. So those were just a couple of thoughts I wanted to throw out there, but I'll stop talking now and I'll let our panelists respond if they want to, or we can just move right on to questions.
I can start. I'll start with the capitalism question. And you know, Elizabeth and I in particular decided that we wanted to emphasize race. But I'm not going to throw Neil Smith under the bus. He did, reckon with race, particularly his idea around revanchism and, what we see in terms of gentrification, hyperpolicing, all sorts of forms of literal and symbolic violence that is visited upon quote unquote undesirable people, or people who stand in the way of profit. He was very clear in the way that was visited upon Black and brown folks, in addition to people who are marginal in other ways. But for me, just considering race as one of many axes of social difference, one of many different, forms of marginalization wasn't enough. It's just simply not enough to explain just the consistency and rigidity of racial hierarchy, of the continued ways that that Black and other folks are disadvantaged. You know, even the folks who are privileged in the sense that they might own and be able to, you know, make an unprecedented amount of money, right? There are all sorts of caveats there. So when I was building and really emphasizing the role of race and structural racism in all of this, I was really calling for us to recenter it in our analysis. And, you know, that just builds on, like, you know, I'm thinking of racial capitalism, right? The idea that there is no capitalism. The modern world system is based on just basically the extraction of value through racial differentiation. Like, capitalism has taken racial directions, and we can't understand the world today and the basic, the violence and exploitation that we witness without understanding how those two are inextricably linked. So so he's there, but I would hit stronger, you know, as I continue to think about how his work is useful for the populations that I'm studying.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly just to say, yeah, absolutely. Agree wholeheartedly with Amanda. And the thing that I think Smith, as much as he gets right, the thing that he misses is in treating race as epiphenomenal to capitalism. And yeah, it's not just one variable of many that can influence how capital accumulation occurs and the process of gentrification happens. It's literally like the form capitalism takes. And then the other thing I wanted to say is in response to your second kind of comment, which is to actually like push back a little bit, which and say that there's nothing inevitable about housing prices, but rather that prices themselves are also constructs. And I have kind of a separate line of research I didn't talk about today on appraisers, and particularly in the US context and the role that they play in valuing people and places, and how that intersects with a lot of what has been talked about today, both in this panel, I'm sure, and in the earlier panel as well. So that is to say, yeah, I think that there are ways through these very thorny issues. I think that people have been advocating for and trying on and really working hard for more just ways to house people, and to do so in ways that really kind of deconstruct the naturalizing way that pricing and rents often get talked about, and the ways that value is often seen as like an outcome of abstract market forces, when it's not. Just like gentrification is an outcome of specific actions of specific actors, so too is value. And so I think that those things are related, and I think that there could be some similar answers to some of those questions.
And you know, I think that this is the question that I ask all the time, or sort of comes up in my subfield, like with artist-led gentrification, is that, well, clearly artists play some sort of slightly different role in this process, or at least a different role, and some different roles attributed to them by the popular press and, you know, scholars. And of course, like, art is, you know, caught up, the art world is caught up within capitalism in many very direct ways, right? But in the same way that artists are treated as somewhat of a special case, art is also a special case, right? How we value arts, you know, who speculates in it, like how that market kind of exists and through what channels becomes a little separate, right? And so it's interesting, I think, to kind of disentangle like how something like how an art market operates like in tandem with a real estate market sort of together, right? Like you can't, you know, you know, SoHo artists were sort of at some point, the early groups in the 1960s, like called upon very directly, like, look, if you want the next New York school of abstract expressionist painting to be the New York school, you need to sort of like allow us to live in these laws, right? And they directly called upon the financial value that the abstract expressionists like created and the amount of tourism that the Metropolitan Museum of Art and MoMA were sort of generating, right? So it's always sort of there. But at the same time, we sort of get to the second question, and I think it's something that frankly I could have done a much better job at, and probably would have, you know, if I'd written the book today, you know, disentangling the role that race plays in that market, right? Like artists oftentimes, there's this assumption that artists are white or whiter than the normal population, at least the artists, that comes when we talk about artists and gentrification, but exactly how sort of that racial privilege played into the story of Soho, and how it continues to sort of shape the dynamics in places like Boyle Heights and Detroit, I think are, critical to understanding this process. Like I absolutely agree with Amanda, as I do in all things. Like, I don't think this is a secondary role being played here. Like race, you can't talk about the history of New York and its development without, having race be, the number one factor, or maybe co-number one with capitalism of some sort.
And actually, I wanted to come back. I really like that poor people like stuff too, because it's real, right? And so, I do in my hopes and dreams, right? There are Black people in the future in Brooklyn, right? But I also think that, people want to participate in the market, right? So I don't have this fiction that, no one's ever going to sell their property, their home. A lot of people, that's why they bought it, right? So they could realize wealth in the future, not just so they could, have like a museum to what life used to be in Black Brooklyn. But, when it comes to those questions about, poor people liking stuff too, I always have to ask what's at stake, right? So what does it mean that when this person sells this home, sure, they might be better off. And of course, they're differential valuations, again, along lines of race. But what does it mean that no Black person will be able to live in that house again? Because these houses, they're getting sold. This happened, a family friend of mine sold the house for $1 million, cute. It got flipped, $4 million. Who's buying that house? It's not anybody's kids in the neighborhood they grew up with, right? And so I think we have to look at what's at stake, what choices are actually really available to people. Is the way out deeper in, So I think we have to always ask ourselves those kinds of questions.
Great. Let's move to some questions now from that are popping up in the chat. I think the first one's coming from Maya Kearney. And she asks, how do you understand the role of local government in your research, particularly offices of planning, community and economic development, etc., and how racially motivated development is masked within these political spaces that are often masked until gentrification has already ravaged communities? Anyone want to take that one?
Happy to let either of you go first.
I can just say that from the research that I did in Houston, the answer seems to be at the interplay of for-profit, not-for-profit developers and these kind of city level community development, and even like city council member offices that have access to specific pockets of funds. I have pages and pages of field notes of being at meetings that were actually brokered by nonprofit, supposedly community development organizations that involved for-profit developers and brokered relationships with local homeowners, but also city planning officials and neighborhood association folks who predictably were in favor of development and kind of like gentrification supporting processes. And so really, I mean, it's to me, it's like, if I were just to put it very simply, like a microcosm of like a growth machine, but what you're like looking at city, nonprofit, for-profit, local homeowners all working towards a specific end of flipping the neighborhood. So, I mean, that's just one case, urban Houston, but that's what I observed. Oh, and racially motivated. Yeah, absolutely. All of this is against the backdrop of sort of like whiteness as like a cultural and spatial phenomenon, and specific standards about what looks good, who do we want in the neighborhood, how do we quote unquote fight crime, all the kinds of racially coded and even in some cases overtly racist language that you might expect from individuals across this kind of constellation of actors, including city officials.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Paul, what in the chat there points out that one could argue, he says, that having more and or better public housing in a neighborhood can escape the problem that I was talking about of improvements inevitably resulting in higher costs. And so he's pointing there to mechanisms of decommodification, which I think obviously would be one way of making concrete, literally and figuratively, improvements in neighborhoods without leading to that pressure on prices. There are also a couple of hands up here. I can see Jan, do you want to, you can chime in if you like directly. You can, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. I would like to pursue this interesting line of the links between race, art, and urban capitalism. If Alfredo Huante had been able to present, he's pursuing some interesting work on the role of the Latinx middle class in the gentrification of Boyle Heights, right? So I think of art increasingly a factor in urban capitalism, yet Leon Trotsky wrote, art can be, art in revolution, art can be a vehicle for revolutionary expression. So that 60s cohort of the Latinx muralists using art as a vehicle for social change, beautification, and self-help graphics, schooling so many Latinx of the 60s and 70s in poster production and muralism, improving their communities. And then by the time that, 50 years later, here comes, Defend Boyle Heights going into meetings of self-help graphics and charging them with being part of the problem. And then I even posed the question to Amanda Boston, Jay-Z as an artist, a musical artist, a mogul, a part-time owner of the Nets, and his approach to the arts being a little different than Nipsey Hussle, say, and his relationship to the community. So to sort of pose questions of that sort and just kind of complicates the issues that for racial ethnic minorities, I mean, it's a new world out there. And I think they're increasingly being called to task for what kind of artists they are. And for the panelists to sort of respond to that, and maybe even thinking about how the real estate professionals, how they use galleries and their relationships to them. But first, I'm kind of interested in how Amanda feels about a character like, Jay-Z and what the perceptions of him are, because there's a lot of pride also there in the Black community in a character like that.
Absolutely. So, hey, I grew up in Brooklyn. Like, I remember when Reasonable Doubt dropped. Like, I'm a Jay fan, right? But, hey, I was a Jay fan before I, started my PhD studies and started, getting to the real, right? And so I think that I had a lot of questions when I found out what was going on behind the scenes in terms of his insistence on this project as a part of a newer, better Brooklyn, his dismissal of that long tradition of activism against the center. He dismissed them as haters, literally, during his opening concerts. This was supposed to be basically a win for the hood. He's coming back to his Bed-Stuy roots to share the spoils of his success, right? He's Bed-Stuy's very own Robin Hood. But he left. The Barclays Center opened in, I want to say, September, and by March he was gone because he wanted to start Roc Nation Sports, right? And there was that conflict of interest between owning that 1/15 of 1% of the arena and also being an agent. So he really, the decisions he made were clearly those of a self-interested entrepreneur and businessman who benefited from this sort of affinity that folks in the neighborhood have with him as a hometown hero, his cultural cachet as one of the foremost icons of hip hop culture and Black popular culture. And I think, we have to do a lot of ideological work with that, because a lot of times our emotional attachments to these figures get in the way of certain criticisms, right? And then there's just the fantasy and ideology of someone attaining that sort of wealth and visibility so we can all do it, right? So there are a lot of layers to that. I'm very conflicted because I, grew up a Jay-Z fan, but I've seen these business moves and, when I'm thinking about the sort of investment that he could make given his business acumen, his vast wealth, and his access to so much, clearly his influence, it's very hard for me to, square the two. Yeah, and that's also a different sort of Black capitalism than Nipsey Hussle. Not to say that, Black capitalism going to save us, but, him partnering with this multi-billion-dollar, organization and team, et cetera, to build this arena that has, been an engine of displacement in Black Brooklyn, is very different than the sort of mom and pop setup that Nipsey Hussle had going on. But I mean, sadly, Nipsey was, taken from us. So it's not clear what direction he was headed, but he certainly had higher aspirations than the small community oriented business that he had. So who's to say what, would have happened? But it's very interesting so there are also lots of layers and levels to Black capitalism, and a lot of work to be done there. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, if I were to respond to the question about sort of the arts, I said it was, it's an honor and privilege to be part of this conference, but I do feel like a little bit like it's that dream where you're back in a college class, like maybe not having prepared, because, as I guess as a historian who sort of came to a subject, came to the study of gentrification decades after, multi-generations of scholars from the social scientists, there can be this, worry like, oh gosh, everything's already been said, and said so well, particularly when you choose to write about SoHo, and there's, of course, a wonderful book about SoHo already. But then, when I reread Smith, there's this sort of dance that I feel between really taking the kind of art and galleries and the dynamics of those markets and those communities seriously, and just using art and gallery or SoHo really as a metonym. It stands in for something. We all know how that works, right? And I don't feel like we do know how that works all really well all the time. And the example that you give, Professor Lin, seems to work, really, well there. Like, oh, well, you have a group of politically active artists who have been in a community for decades. They open up a gallery space, unfortunately, and this maybe gets back to Tim's, kind of question, like, can't we have nice things occasionally? Could you imagine anything that would send developers into a tizzy more than like, oh, political activists, Latinx artists opening up a gallery in a neighborhood, like that screams authenticity, that screams stability. But, it's not those artists' fault that it does that, right? So are they not allowed to open up a space or an education center or, start a community development corporation? Like it feels like, the stories we tell put anyone associated with the culture industry into such a bind. Like you can't do anything without putting up this, red flag to develop, or I don't know what colors are, signal to developers that you should come in here. But then what does that actually leave the actual, the artist who wants to make good work? Right?
Thanks, Aaron. I think, did Zaya Dinsey Flores have a question? A raised hand earlier, but I don't see one now. If not, maybe we can go to Derek. You put a comment there, Derek, in the chat. Do you want to amplify it at all or vocalize it?
Sure. Just again, another fantastic panel. I feel like I am in class and I'm learning a ton, and I really like this class. Like, let's keep this class going. Like, let's not have 2 days. Let's have a long semester, and also let's get in person. And let's get some drinks. So that's the other part that we got to include in this conference. But yeah, I mean, I really like that we're kind of trying to hit on the undercurrents of gentrification. Is it class or race-based? I mean, many people already talked about it. Depends on the context that you're in. And I just, in my comment, just said, look, I mean, the US is a particular context, and it has whopping wealth and income inequality. And just think of the banking system. Think about the minority-owned banks in the U.S. We talk about like individual wealth inequality differences, but let's look at institutional differences on white-controlled banks in the U.S. versus minority-controlled banks. It is staggering. The inequality is humongous. So, developers want to buy low and sell high. Who's got the wealth? Who has the institutional wealth? Who has the individual wealth to purchase properties, whether it's single family, multifamily, and then when they get rehabbed, who has the financial capital to, as an individual, to buy the high income apartments, condos, or homes? It is overwhelmingly white in the US because of our wealth inequality. So when we think about gentrification in the US, even though it was, Ruth Glass's definition was on class-based, we have to include race because the racial inequality is so stark in the US. And that's just the point. But one other comment I would just say is that, Elizabeth, with your depiction of two different developers, a white developer, right, and I think a Hispanic developer, and the Hispanic developer was being a little more kind to the community or something. But I would say with my own research, I mean, I've seen Black developers in Harlem, Black developers on the south side of Chicago, and African-American developers in Shaw U Street in Washington, D.C., and they're capitalists and they want to make money. And I don't see any of them being kind to anybody in the community other than being kind to the people that can help them make money. So, I mean, maybe your example in Houston, you saw something different. But most developers, they have an interest to make money and they have to pay back their investors. So they're thinking make money first, people secondary. But anyway, so capital important, race really important, and in the US, you got to bring those two together to understand the gentrification processes and also the outcomes.
One of the things I found in looking at like how this group of SoHo artists, was able to sort of enter into non-standard mortgage agreements in order to buy their lofts, they mostly just got money from their parents, right? And so the money that sort of, again, this is not a large-scale developer, but these are folks who, they're mostly white families living in the suburbs. So that racial inequality and racial capitalism is essentially funneling the money to these, to support SoHo lofts. I think it's the similar reasons that, different form of capital, the artists were able to sit down with, to go back to the question about the role of local planning, they're able to kind of sit down with the city, a relatively disinterested city planning commission who kind of didn't want this problem, but also didn't see it as a route to future wealth for the city. But, because they had access to financial capital, to cultural capital, to academic capital, they were able to kind of sit down with planners and literally write planning codes that would govern what would happen in SoHo. They weren't necessarily doing it with the dreams of selling their loft for $10 million one day, but they were able to generate a relatively stable place to live because of this, to all the privileges they had access to.
Yeah, and just to jump in a little bit, like you mentioned, Derek, in my research in Houston, I absolutely did ethnographic work and interviews with some developers of color, including 2 Black developers and 5 or 6 Latinx developers. And most of them pursued the same kinds of development strategies as their white counterparts. But what I argue in my book and elsewhere is very similar to what Mary Patillo, Kimberly K. Huang, and many others have argued, which is that their strategies are necessitated by literally the white supremacist logics of capital accumulation in our society. And so it's not just a matter of of class exploitation in those situations. It's that the literal backdrop for how value is constructed, for how property is treated in both legal, socially, economic ways. All of that is structured by those logics, and it's always against that backdrop of white supremacy. So again, I agree with you. It's incredibly important to always keep race and class in view in the U.S. context. And I think the way that that's often done in gentrification research is to view them as separable phenomena that that can be studied independently when in fact we know that's not how it works. So yeah.
Zawadi, do you want to chime in there? I see from the comment in the chat, but you can vocalize it if you like. I will vocalize it then. So she says, Zawadi says, we need to start naming the whiteness that is omitted from discussions of a lot of gentrification research. Ruth Glass was studying a working class white neighborhood with middle class white in movers. And then Tom Slater elaborates on the comment by pointing out that Islington, which was the area that Glass was studying, was more mixed than she made out, which in and of itself was interesting. But I think partly because of the presence of lots of public housing. But any further reflections on that? We're moving close to our time, so but we do have time for one or two more comments.
If no one's asking anything yet, I'll just chime in. Erin, your work is also helpful for me to think about because I'm working on something on basically that Black arts movement in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill with Spike Lee and sort of all the Black up and coming artists. And, you know, again, it was a move at the time of severe disinvestment, but, you know, once things took off for them, I think Spike Lee selling his brownstone was one of the kind of a landmark moment in real estate valuation. And so I'm super interested to think more about just those differences in terms of, you know, I would say that this movement was an example of what happens when Black folks are allowed to create community and art in their own image, but it's still not separate from the market. And so I'd just love to see how the dynamic of these young Black professionals in this sort of multimedia, so it wasn't just limited to fine arts and what have you, it was movies, film, television, music, et cetera, and how that parallel the sort of rise of artists in Soho. So you're giving me a lot to think about.
Thank you. No, that sounds fascinating.
Great.
Okay, guys. Well, I think we've all worked very hard, especially the presenters. I've just had to unmute myself occasionally. That's easy. So I want to thank everyone on this panel and all of the other panels today for your wonderful presentations. Tomorrow we're going to reconvene. I hope you all can join us again. We're going to start off tomorrow. Tomorrow's kickoff time is at 11 with a panel on social arguments about gentrification. Then we'll have another panel at 1, and then we'll wrap things up with our keynote speaker, who is Tom Slater from the University of Edinburgh at 3 p.m. tomorrow. So hope you can join us again tomorrow for more great discussion. And thanks very much.
Thank you. Do the chat thing. Yeah. Congrats again on the job, Amanda. That sounds great.
Well, thank you. You got to give me all the intel about Pittsburgh now.
I can try. It's very. It's like all my intel about Chicago. It's like very out of date. But yeah, no, you should. I went there with a class 2 years ago, but it's not just northwest of the campus, but also east, because like the stuff that it's already sort of feels more like your work, but like what happened in East Liberty is the kind of like ridiculous story of that. Like it's pretty. Yeah,